Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Search, Deploy, Commit. I'm your host, Jack, and I'm here with JKL, one of my most recent game host favorites. JKL, thank you so much for being on the show with me as we sort of kick off another season of Search, Deploy, Commit.
Thank you, Jack. Happy 2024. I'm really happy to be here, and thank you for your kind words. I'm really honored to be one of your favorite hosts these days.
Yeah, no, it's been interesting for me, because I've kind of been off for maybe about 6 months from any kind of episodes, and now getting back into it really is a big part of your work because I've just enjoyed your format so much. It's got me back in the itch to start doing interviews again and doing work again, and I really just wanted to talk to you and get your thoughts because I've been so impressed with the games that you've been creating, and even just the overall setup it's been really impressive. So thank you so much for being on. And like I like to start with a lot of my guests, tell me a little bit about how you got started in Warzone.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I got started, I believe, in 2018, and at first I just played the single player games. So just grinding through those levels, eventually hit a wall, and then I kind of stopped from there. And then I would make games for myself where I just play against a bunch of AIs. But it wasn't until like at least 2 years in that I started doing multiplayer games that were more than quick match games. So initially it was just, 1v1, 2v2. And then about 2 years ago, started doing a little bit of multiplayer, but then it was like kind of overwhelming for me. So then I stopped. I'm very sad and I would like to apologize to all the people that I kind of got booted in those games on if they were relying on me. But it really only was until I think about a year and a half ago that I really started getting into multiplayer. There were a lot of games that um, were designed with kind of all sorts of different setups. So of course you have your diplomacy games, your free for all games, some local deployment games, and then yeah, I just like really fell in love with the multiplayer space. And then I decided, I can be a creator too. There's nothing really holding me back. So I started trying out some formats, and we can talk a little bit more about that. But that's generally how uh, my interaction with this game has been. Oh, I've also been like playing the idle game for like the past like year or so. I think the first level I started like just when Idle started, completely gave up on it. It took me like 700 days to complete it, but now I'm like getting pretty good, burning through all the levels like pretty quickly now.
That's really cool, and I appreciate sort of the introduction. And I've been talking to a lot of my friends about playing recently. Obviously, as I've been doing this, I would say that the majority of my friends that I know in person don't necessarily play along with, but when they do, they get started on single player, and they get a little bit nervous sometimes about jumping into the multiplayer because they realize how good some of the multiplayer games are and how high of a level some of those people are at. Um, how would you say that your first experience in the multiplayer was? I mean, what really pulled you in out of single player into multiplayer?
I think I've always really enjoyed history and like alternate history as well. So when people design these games and you can role play as a country, I think initially it's kind of daunting because you'll see the same people in like all of these games, and this will be a point we'll probably also talk about later. But the same people will always take the spots of like the most like the largest and most important countries. So when you're playing like a World War II map and you have to play as like Bulgaria and someone's the Soviet Union, I think it's a little bit disheartening at first.
Sure.
Usually you get steamrolled or like something happens where you never really have a chance to win. But I think eventually, at least for me, I got put into a slot that I actually enjoyed, a relatively significant player. And then I feel like when you're playing with other people, like actually role playing, like that's a lot of fun. Um, and then I also recall, like pretty early on, I designed my own game that was not a typical Warzone game. If anyone's watched the movie Circle, it's like a movie where it's like 40 people standing in a room, just like a little energy beam thing in the center, and then every 2 minutes someone dies. And then in the movie, they just like talk to each other, and then they have to vote. And whoever gets the most votes dies. So it's like very much like you know not a typical Warzone game where like there's a map called, I
Yeah.
think it's like Diamond or something. There's a bunch of circles and a diamond
Okay.
in between. So I would be the player in the center with the diamond with like a million troops, and then everyone else was like on the side, and they would,
Hmm.
just converse in group chat and DM me like who they're voting for that round. And then eventually I just eliminate them one by one until there's one person remaining, in which in that case I just surrendered and let that person win. So also like very early on from my multiplayer days, I hosted a game that was like not super standard. And then from there, it also like made me realize, oh, like multiplayer is pretty fun. Like, you get to chat to a lot of people, and combined with like taking on some roles that were more important in other people's games, that really gave me a love for playing multiplayer.
That's cool. Yeah, I would say that that was a big turning point for me was understanding that, wow, I can have a conversation with somebody else about this game, and I can get into a position where I can have an understanding and work alongside somebody versus just, going against 5 or 6 AIs by myself. Um, so that's really cool. And then so obviously it expanded from there because you're like, well, what is holding me back from creating games? And you got started, what I'm, I guess, calling a game host. How did you start hosting, your own multiplayer games?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think I'd like to shout out this player called Voodoo who gave me inspiration. So he created this map. Um, it's called like something like Shattered Europe or like something in the Europe huge map where there's like, I don't know, like 2,000 territories. And basically, he made it so that each player would have like, I don't know, like 30 different starting points all throughout the map. And then you would like slowly build out. Um, and then a ton of players. It's like I think you started with like 35 players. Some of the players would go AI, and they would like basically become like zombie players on the map, and then you'd slowly consolidate, and then you'd fight other players. So I played this game. I actually won this game somehow. I don't really know, uh, due to luck or
Nice.
something. But what really got me thinking was like, oh, like when players become AIs, like that's really fun because then even though you're playing with other players, you have a common incentive to remove what we call like zombie players. Like you can even role play and be like, oh, there's like a horde of zombies coming in.
Yeah,
So
sure.
I designed some of my own games similar to him, where I believe it was, I don't think it was local deployments, but I think it was like a game where you can build cities. And then, yeah, you start out with like 25 players, but you each start out with like 25 territories. So the map starting out was like
Sure.
super chaotic, but then eventually, like everyone kind of narrows down. And then, half the players go AI within the first like 5 turns, and then you like kind of battle it. So, like, that was good, but I feel like it was a very kind of unique and overwhelming play style for a lot of players. So, I kind of stopped making those maps. But we can, I mean, if you want to ask questions how I exactly got into local deployments, or give any commentary in between, I'll give some space, or else I can
Sure.
just delve into that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I wanted to, kind of give you credit, and I've said this to other game hosts. I I picked up, I think, on one of your local deployment games, and for anybody that isn't familiar with local deployment, if you're new to Warzone, essentially you're going to have your troops placed on a location bonus. From a regular Warzone game, you would be able to put them anywhere. But with local deployment, you can only put them where that bonus is giving it to you. So I picked up on one of your games, JKL, and I was just having so much more fun than I thought I was going to. And, as I played more and more of yours, I was really happy to continue to get invites. And I started creating local deployment games just because in a way, I was inspired. So I wanted to give you credit with that before I kind of ask my next question. Is you're giving credit to the people that, inspired you to make host games, because I think that's really a big part of what Warzone is and why it's continued for years and years and years. Is people are like, wow, I'm just so into whatever it is you've created. I want to continue on that. So I think that's been, really impressive, and I appreciate that. So um, thanks for doing that. But then, kind of leading into that, how did you get started with local deployment?
Yeah, thank you so much for your kind words. Also, I believe I am currently beating you in that game that you created. Just gonna put that out there.
Yeah, I'm pretty positive that I don't win most of the games, but I just have so much fun playing in
Yeah.
them that it's an absolute blast.
Oh, yeah. So I think there's also 2 points as to what inspired me. So I used to play a lot of the quick matches, but then eventually I was like, man, these local deployment games are like the most fun. And they require like a lot more skill on like larger maps than just deploying all at the same time. So eventually I got to a point where like I deselected all the maps except for like the 2v2 and like 1v1 Europe local deployment games. It's like a small map about like 100, about like 200 territories. And then I was like, this is so
Right.
fun. Someone invited me to like a local deployment game as well. It was like all of North and South America, about like 1,000 territories. But then in his game, like once you surrendered, like you just all your territories became neutral. So like the players, like the
Mm,
troops are no longer in play. And I was like, I feel like this is like very much just a luck based game, depending on like where you get placed. Because the moment someone becomes AI, let's say you're in like Central America, and then entire like North America becomes neutral, then like you have all the space to expand. But the South America player, they're kind of screwed. I was like, you
right.
know what? I was inspired by Voodoo by having the players go AI, so I kind of combined all these elements. And I don't exactly recall what my first game was, but I remember creating one of these games. And for this, it does take a little bit of work where like you have to go into the bonuses and you have to make sure that none of them overlap. So, for example, let's say
Yes.
like you're playing a map where there's like Europe and the Middle East, and then a country like Germany, and has like three bonuses that are regions of Germany, like Southern Germany, Western Germany, Eastern Germany, and then a bonus for like all of Germany. You can't have all of them overlapping, so you have to remove like the big Germany bonus. So I remember like taking some time to do this, creating my first game of like 25 players, making it so that if you surrender or you're booted after not playing for 2 days, then you become an AI, and it just really became a huge success. And then I was like, you know what? There's so many other maps that could make this playstyle also happen. So I think right now I'm at like 20 or so different templates. And what I think
Wow.
makes this a little bit different than other games is most local deployment games, they either happen in real time or they're pretty small. And you typically play with like, I think like max, like usually like 6 to 10 I've seen. But for my games are usually like 20 to 25 players. And you usually have a map of around 500 to like 900 territories. And I just think it's like a bit more fun because first of all, you cannot just overwhelm another player instantaneously. You kind of have to, build up your troops, build up a supply convo. If you have a front in Russia and a front in France, you can't just dump all your troops on one side. You have to like
Right.
slowly build out troops for like, Germany to Poland to Russia, or vice versa into France. And then I think like it just makes the game, you like have to really think about like, if I'm pushing my troops to one side of the map, I'm not really going to be able to put troops on the other side of the map very quickly. So it does require you to like talk to other players, and requires you to, make sure that you're like really being strategic. And I think it's being strategic in a way that many other games don't really have this component. So I think, I think it's been a lot of fun. A lot of people have really enjoyed it. So I think every time I create a new game, I post the link in one of the old games in the chat so everyone else can see it. And you kind of see the same, like dozen or so people in all the games. That makes me really happy as well.
Yeah. Right. And you end up, building on those previous relationships. I think I've mentioned this to a couple people in your games where I've made a deal with one player to get a deal in another game, which is kind of hilarious that it would overlap like that. But I think that's part of the fun, right? I mean, there's so many different strategies when it comes to local deployment. I think your points on local deployment strategies are really really good because as a player, I wouldn't consider myself very very good in general. I'm probably one of the worst Warzone players out there, but I think one of the things about local deployment is it helps make up for some of that barrier because of the troops needing to be put out in some ways. Not that the good players don't win, but it does help give a little bit more of an edge to somebody that's maybe newer or wants to get into a multiplayer game. Um,
That's an interesting point.
tell me.
I think to become a really good local deployments game, obviously it requires skill as in other types of games, but I do think there's a more even playing field. Everyone starts out, just three territories on the map. There's no, someone starts out as Russia, someone starts out as like Italy. So I think, yeah, there is a more even playing field for people to get involved in this game.
Yeah. I mean, and I guess sort of building off of that, what do you think about local deployment in the the niche of the wide variety of other strategies? Obviously, we've spoken to a couple of those items in comparison. Where with a regular multiplayer game, you can just dump all 1,000 troops on one spot and just steamroll somebody that's maybe weaker than you. What are some of the things what are your thoughts on, local deployment in comparison?
Yeah, so I think the number one thing that I really like about the games that I create is that they end. So this might sound a little bit strange, but if you play a lot of role playing games, there eventually becomes a point where, let's say you start with 30 players, and then eventually there's like 10 players left after everyone's eliminated, the other rivals. But then
Yeah,
at that point, it's like everyone's built up such a complex web of alliances that nobody really wants to attack each other. So then the game just kind of stalls out, where like everyone just deploys troops in their own territories, but nobody attacks each other for fear that like,
sure.
if I go to war with you and like I'll lose troops and then, like I'm disincentivized from attacking. So with local deployments, like if you think you're gonna lose, you become an AI, it pushes the game along, and then usually it comes to a point where, because there's like fog and you can't see all the other players, you're incentivized to keep attacking. And so usually my games, like after usually around like 40 to 50 turns or so, like they actually end. And I think that's great because, you know, I don't know about other players, but I would prefer not to be in a game for like well over a year and a half, and eventually, nothing really happens in this game. So I think that's like pretty interesting. The
Yeah,
second thing is, I think compared to some of the other games, like I design my games to be large, so it banks on the fact that some players will surrender or get booted, and it won't really impact the game too much. I think with some other games, like especially some games where, not to dunk on them all the time, but like some of the role playing games, like if a really important player, like you're playing a World War II map and the player as Germany, like just gets booted from the game, like it's game over. Like you can't really role play with
yeah,
an AI. You can't really play the game when Germany's all of their territories have gone neutral. But I think what's really good about some of the games that I create, I'm like, I want to make it so that even if a player leaves the game or surrenders, it doesn't really impact the overall gameplay too much. Um,
mm,
and I also think with like, with local deployments versus just a general multiplayer game, when a player goes AI, it's almost a little bit easier for everyone else because when we talk about the, no dumping 1,000 troops all at once, if you're playing against an AI, let's say Germany goes AI, someone's France, someone's Poland. Well, like with a local deployment game, you know that AI can only deposit a certain number of troops and like relatively equal number of troops on each, bonus that the player has like left the game from. So all the players around them, they could face like generally equal odds unless the players already placed a bunch of troops on their border. But that's like, it's relatively fair versus if in a normal game someone goes AI, right? Like the France player may get five troops deployed on their side, and the AI just might so happen to deploy like 500 troops on the Polish side. And like, like if the France player then wins the game, like can they really say it was due to their own efforts or was it more due to luck? So I try to make my games in a way that, there obviously is some luck to the game, but it is generally a bit less than other games. It requires a little bit more skill and also is not so heavily dependent on other players staying in the game so that regardless of what happens, hopefully everyone can have a similar playthrough. And it's like relatively standardized across like all the maps that I create.
yeah. No, those are really good points. I think just how it really translates well when you do have somebody go AI is really important, especially in a role playing game. And what I think is interesting about your map specifically, and most local deployment maps that I've come across, is how very um, easy it is to form alliances without even setting rules for it. Um, how it's just in your best interest to naturally do those types of things. And I think that part of the diplomacy in these games is really what I enjoy more than putting troops on a map. um, more than destroying someone or even winning a game. I just like the stories that get created from any game of Warzone, but these have done a really good job, I think, of facilitating that on their own without creating um, any rules per se. Even
Yeah,
uh,
that's true. I only say alliances are allowed, but there are no specific rules about how they should be formed. But we can delve more into that if you'd
right,
like.
yeah, that's kind of what I was gonna say next. As far as strategies. I think is something that you had mentioned that you wanted to kind of get into from a local deployment sense. What are some strategies that you enjoy? For me personally, I think that's a big one, is trying to identify who's around me based on those three spots that I start with, or however the game is formatted. How do I set myself up to, look ahead without being able to see the majority of the map? I think is a really fun part of the game. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so it's definitely just overall gameplay. Like I think most players know, like it's better to start out at like the edge of a map than it is in the center, especially with local deployment, especially with people going AI, because you never know how many fronts you're going to get. So generally, I think like, okay, I'm starting with three territories. Which one of those three is the most uh, easy to kind of expand in the future and be defensible? And I generally try to place like more of the troops there. And then if I can connect two of the early territories together, that would be ideal as well. But of course, inevitably, usually, turn 2 to 5, you encounter another player. And I think for me, like most other players starting out, they feel a sense of precarity or a sense of danger, right? They're like, oh man, like if I immediately get into a war now, then someone else, another one of these 25 players, like they might not get into a war. They might, conserve their troops. So I think initially when you like first touch someone, you're like, hey man, like, do you want to have peace? And they're like, yeah, sure, like let's have peace. Almost like overwhelmingly like that's the case. But then I think eventually you start touching more and more players, and you're like, probably not best to have peace with everyone. So then it becomes like, who do I think of the one or two players that of like maybe you're touching 5 or 6 players and like, okay, I should probably attack like one or two of them. Which one of them is most likely to give me a sense of victory, right? A chance of victory. I think this is like the most like tricky part in the early game because you're like, if I mess up, then it's kind of game over for me because like if you weaken
Yeah,
yourself so much in the early game, like you can't really continue the game and like reasonably achieve success. So that's like one issue.
right.
Another issue is like who is likely to go AI because I think sometimes you'll be like, okay, like I have a really long front with someone. I'm starting out in the game, so I don't really have like troops to move to that front if I'm suddenly attacked there. Do I trust that player? Hopefully, like most of the cases, I've never really had someone betray me in the early game too much. But then it's like, what if that player is so weak that they decide to, surrender and they become an AI? And then that's kind of a headache because sometimes you'll be like, okay, I'm doing really well. Like I have one of my fronts that's going swimmingly. I'm like steamrolling the other player that I've picked. And then like two of your allies within the course of like 3 turns both go AI, and then like all your friends start collapsing at once, and you're like, oh man, like this game is a total loss, and that's really
Yeah,
unfortunate. So I think when it comes to like player etiquette, which we can also delve a little bit more later on,
yeah,
generally like it's best to let your allies know that you're going AI, or like I mean, if you get booted, usually you can't really tell someone that you're going to get booted. And for listeners who aren't aware, that's like if you don't take your turn within 2 days, like you just get booted from the game and you become an AI. But if you haven't taken your turn in 2 days, you can't really warn people since you're not playing the game. But generally, like it's good to let your allies know that hey, man, like our friend that you're not defending, like it's gonna start facing troops there soon. So sometimes like you want to negotiate with someone, like hey, I'm gonna put like 5 or 10 troops along our border, and since all the bonuses you can generally only deploy like 3 to 5 troops, then even if they deploy troops and they go AI, they're not really able to break your bonus. So that's something as well. Um, and then just one more thing, I think like later in the game, I've usually had it so that players generally start, becoming AI players. They start surrendering, they get booted. So usually, like, even if you're at peace with 5 players, it's pretty likely that one of them will become an AI. So you can just kind of go into their territories. The tricky situation is what happens when there's a bunch of strong players and all of them are waiting for someone to attack them first or to drag them into war. And I think at this point, it's like really important to know like who you can trust and who you can't trust, or to identify a player that's like the biggest threat. So, for example, if you're playing a map of Europe and you're like Central Europe, maybe you want to attack the Western Europe player because like they can only move east, so eventually they're going to attack you. So maybe it's best to like make them your next target. But of course, it's like each of the maps are different. The end games are all different. I think generally like getting a good starting point, making sure that preparing for emergencies, having like a stockpile of troops that you can airlift in case of danger. These are all pretty important steps. But once again, like each of the games is different, so it's really hard to tell for certain like what's the best strategy.
Yeah, I think that's a special piece of Warzone in general, is that the games are so incredibly different based on each map, each position. You're really never going to experience the same game unless you're playing on some really, really small maps that people end up memorizing positions on and getting really good at. But I think that's the fun part of the game, and obviously everybody now that's listened knows your strategies, JKL. So not that the cat's out of the bag in any way, but
I still have a couple tricks up my
good
sleeve.
advice
So
either way.
yeah.
No, I think it's good advice either way, because I think we're all trying to figure out ways to get an edge, and maybe for new players, just trying to learn more about the game, enjoying listening to somebody like yourself talk about it, and that's why that's why we do this in the first place. So
Of course, yeah.
You touch a little bit on etiquette. I think this is a very interesting subject because everybody has a different perspective on this, especially depending on the games themselves. Right, certain games the host will create rules and people need to adhere by those, otherwise it's out of etiquette. Some games people maybe feel that there should be an etiquette across all the different games. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what you think would be considered good Warzone etiquette.
Yeah, so I think generally all of my games, they just say this is a local deployments game. You're allowed to create alliances. If you get booted or you surrender, you become an AI. That's generally like all of my rules. So you can play the game however you want. But I think generally from what I've observed, even though this isn't formalized, I've been noticing kind of the same things throughout the game. So first of all, like generally people do form alliances. It's people tend to not play the game alone because it's like pretty difficult to win if everyone else is forming alliances and you're not. But with alliances, it's like, how do you break this alliance, right? And I think for some people, they're just like, okay, it's the end game. I got to strike first against someone before they get too powerful. Let's say if I have 80 troops per turn and they have 120 troops per turn, they're a little bit stronger than me. But if I attack them first and break all the bonuses along our border, it may be like we'll be on even footing, and then I'll have a higher chance of winning. Of course, this is one way to do it. I've had it done to me before. I beat that player, so kind of jokes on them. But I think like it makes you trust that player less across the other games. And I think there's sort of this meta thing that we're talking about, right? Where you're like negotiating with one player in one game, that kind of affects me in another game as well. Generally, I haven't had it so that like it's impacted across games too much. But I do feel like if you consistently encounter a player that every time you ally with them, they end up breaking it without giving you any sort of notice, probably you don't want to ally with them in the future. So that's just something to like think about. And then another thing is like, do you give notice to someone? So sometimes you give like a 1 turn notice. Sometimes some players will even say, I'll give a 2 turn notice. So what that means is, let's say on turn 40, you message someone saying, hey, I'm going to start breaking our alliance pretty soon. So either, you have 2 turns to kind of move your troops up, then attack, or 1 turn, like the next turn you're going to attack. So generally, I think like it's better to say to someone, hey, let's have a truce with like a 1 or 2 turn notice than to just leave it up to whatever, But I think most players tend to be pretty nice where they give you some sort of notice. And then, of course, like we talked about earlier, like if you're going to go AI and you're going to go AI, it's probably best to tell your allies. I haven't been perfect about this, and someone kind of called me out on it, and they're like, "Hey, man, like not cool. Like why am I being attacked. And I definitely faced a situation where like all of my allies start to, like I've said, like overrun my front lines, and I'm like, oh man, this is a disaster. Like I was putting all my troops to attack one player, and now I'm facing three. So yeah, generally pretty good to tell your allies. And then finally, I think it's like if you know you're gonna lose the game, it's probably best to surrender. Um, I think like with single player, or sorry, with the quick match games, like the games where you're just playing like kind of in a short amount of time, like people know they're like, okay, like I want to end this quick match game so I can play the next one. So if I know I'm going to lose, I'm going to surrender and just give the other player the victory so we can move on to another game. But with my games, like when you're playing a huge map and eventually someone has like 400 troops per turn, they have like, I don't know, like 150 bonuses to deploy to. It takes a lot of time to like deploy to all the bonuses. And if you're facing a player that's like obviously losing, they have like, maybe like 30 to 50 armies per turn, and they're just like constantly getting beat back, right? It doesn't take them a very long time to deploy their troops. So it's really not considered good etiquette to, this is like the one point I really do want to stress, like the other, like how you play and betray people, like okay, that's just like part of the game to win. But if you know you're gonna lose, like don't be a sore loser. Like don't make someone like spend like 10 minutes like every single turn deploying when you only have to spend 1 minute. It's happened to me twice. It's really annoying. I think generally like most people, like if they know they won, like they know they won, they move on to the next game. It's not like I have only one or two games where you can play this type of game, right? So I tell a lot of people, sometimes I even DM them. I'm like, hey man, like, it looks like you're about to win. I'm just gonna surrender and like let's create a rematch game. Or like, hey guys, like I'm stronger than all of the other players combined. How about we all agree to surrender? Or how about all of you guys agree to surrender at once, and then we'll create another rematch game. So yeah, I think the last point I just want to stress, like, you're gonna lose, like please surrender. Don't be that one player that folds up everyone else. And yeah, I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective. It's funny because I I'm into board games, and I was in a position recently where um, I'm a big Twilight Imperium fan, and I was in a position to win the game, and I had two of my friends that were in a position to win the game, and it ended up being completely out of my control. But uh, one of my friends really wanted me to try and pressure and keep the other one from winning, but I ended up leaving it up to chance and said, well, I'm just going to leave it up to a dice roll because for me, I'm going to lose in either case. So I think it's an interesting perspective because sometimes one of those players might alter the game so that somebody else could win. And it's really up to that player sometimes to decide if they want to change the force of the game or not. And again, yes, that might drag out the game longer than anybody wants to. It might shorten the game. But at the same time, I think each game's a little bit different. So I guess we might have a little bit of a difference of opinion on that subject specifically. But I think I agree, in some extents where there's an overwhelming, obvious perspective that somebody's won the game. And in those cases, it can definitely be a, hey, let's just move on. Let's create another one. So yeah,
Yeah,
I really think. Go ahead.
I think what I'm talking about usually is a 1v1 scenario towards the end. But if there's like,
Sure.
three other players that have 40% of the map, one player 60% of the map, it's like feasible that those 40% of players or 40% of the map could do something to change the game. I think in that sense, like you're right, like anything could happen.
Yeah. But we're talking like 80-20, 90-10.
Yeah,
It might be
just
worth
like
it at that point to just say, let's wrap this up.
yeah.
I get it. No, that's good. I think it's really good for people to talk about these kinds of things, especially as there aren't a lot of rules. We set the rules. So, as a host, I think that's good for you to talk about and share your preferences and to make sure that that's clear to everybody. Even just publicly like this, I think is great. So,
Of course. And go ahead if
curious.
you want to ask.
Oh, go ahead. No, please.
I was just going to say, like, because you brought this up earlier, like what can happen to some player who knows they're not going to win, but they can change the game. And I think what's really interesting about alliances is like sometimes with an alliance, you make it with someone and you're like, the implicit understanding is like, if that person gets too strong, I'm going to band with the other players in the game before like there's a clear winner or loser to kind of turn on that player, give them notice, and be like, hey man, you're getting too strong. There's another player I'm also allied with. We're going to team up against you. And I feel like that's usually like no hurt feelings. Like everyone understands like you're playing to win. But I think what's really interesting is sometimes like there is a sense of loyalty to another player. So someone like clearly knows they're going to lose, but yet they're still loyal to you, which I think is very interesting. So like I had a game one time where like I had like half the map, and you had these two small players. I think there's like 6 players remaining. There's only like 4 big players, 2 small players. They each only had like 1 territory, so like they could only generate like the default 5 plus like the 1 or 2 from that bonus from that territory, and they would just stack troops to like 200 or 300. But yet they would help me, right? So like someone else in a different part of the map, like they had some scattered territories. So I told these 2 players, it's like, hey man, like if you want to continue getting cards, like if you like take the territory every turn to get a card, a couple cards. So like if you want to keep getting cards, like I'll let you move through my lands, and then can you like sweep up the other players like lands there, and then I'll like kind of take up the like territories you've left behind. And surprisingly, like they helped me, right? So like they were willing to kind of as their own player, as their own free agent, to not surrender, but instead like help the player that they've been allied with the entire game. I think that's really interesting how like you never really know what to expect sometimes.
Yeah, no, totally. I think that's what's interesting about some of this, right? I mean, in a way, it's king making, but it's up to each of those players to decide to do that. They could have made your life difficult as well, and I think that's the interesting spin on it. That those players could have said, well, no, I'm just going to continue to stack here, and I'll go to the highest bidder. But there's nothing in it for them to win. They know eventually they're going to lose. So it's an interesting motion of the game that we all go through. Not necessarily that exact scenario, but we all have those games where we're way up or we're way down, and what we decide to do, what each player decides to do in each game, I think is really, really interesting, and what makes a game fun to find out what's going to happen at the end.
Definitely.
As a host, I've been really impressed with the amount of effort that you put into your games, and obviously you have a bunch of templates now that you put the work in, so you can continue to put those out. And I definitely encourage you, and I'm sure plenty of other players would encourage you to keep putting those out. But what is some tips maybe for somebody that wants to get started hosting their own games that you could provide from your perspective? Not necessarily even just for local deployment, obviously that is your niche, but what are maybe some bits of advice or practices that you found are good, especially on those bonuses? That's a major part of setting up a local deployment game.
Yeah, so kind of as we talked about earlier, like local deployments was not initially my niche. I was kind of shopping around, doing a bunch of different things. So I think when someone is starting to create multiplayer games, they want to be a host, like whatever gives you creativity, like go for it, right? I think there's some players who make games where like most of the bonuses are removed. There's only a couple of them. I think there's like a map for like Liverpool local deployments where like only certain like factories and stuff. Like this player like consistently like creates this game over and over again. So like if you play Warzone, like you'll probably find this map. It's very unique. Yeah, and then there's like other games where sometimes people will like times 10 the bonuses. So instead of like 3 armies per turn, they'll be like 30 armies per turn. So suddenly you're playing with like thousands of troops in this game. I think just like if you're someone that wants to host games, like just kind of go for it. Like create whatever you think is interesting to you, and then usually 1 or 2 of your templates or the gameplay style, people will really like it, and then you might continue on going from there. Of course, like nobody's obligating you to make these games. You can always switch. You can always, I guess stop grading them if you get busy. But I think generally, like if you have a love for the game, you'll probably just experiment a bit, and then you'll like settle on something. I think there's like a player, chat to some players like Rage Royale and like Plays, like PLAYZ. They create a lot of like role playing games, and I feel like they're doing a really good job just like doing the thing that makes that works for them. But of course, like everyone can find something that like they enjoy playing the most.
Totally. I think that's great advice, right? Do what do what keeps you engaged. Do what's going to keep you coming back. That's great advice. Kind of jumping back into the gameplay, because I think that's really why we're all here in Warzone. Tell me about some of the games. I mean, obviously you've touched on a couple of them, but maybe tell me about, one of your favorite games, or maybe a group of memorable games that really stand out to you, that you just, they're the games that make you come back, right? Tell me a little bit
Yeah,
about those
absolutely.
for you.
So I think there's like two types of games that give you a lot of satisfaction. The one is like you just kind of win like from the start to the end, and you're like, dang, like I played all my cards right, like everything kind of fell in line, and like I did really good for myself. So there was a map I created called Medieval Britain. So it's like just the island of Great Britain, nothing else, no Ireland or anything like that. And in this game, like I started out kind of in the middle of the map, and then I just kept expanding, and then I aligned with all the other players. So I was like kind of always at peace with everyone until they went AI. But for this game, I never had to betray any of my allies. But all of my allies were like enemies of each other, but not of me. So it was very like helpful, because even though I'm the strong player and like these players ideally should, fight me instead of each other, since they're already fighting each other, they're kind of overcommitted. And if they betray me, like, I can just sweep into them. So it was very interesting to me, because I was like, okay, like I learned from this that it's really important to select your allies wisely, and then also maybe just let other players attack each other, so that they know, okay, if I'm, if like 40% of my troops are attacking another player, like I can't just betray my other ally. Like that would cause a ton of troubles for me. So if you're in a position of strength, like that's something to consider. And then
Yeah.
other games that are really notable is like when you have that really like hard fought out victory. And there was one game, it's like an Arctic Ocean map. So kind of imagine like a CD player where like, like the center, you can't really deploy, but like all around the sides of the CD, right? Like you can deploy going from like Alaska, all the way down to and around back into Siberia, right? Um, and like I thought I was doing really well. Like I was playing as the Alaska player, I was swooping into Canada. I thought I was like really, really strong. But then there was like another player that was even stronger, pretty much had like all of Russia. And I thought I was really going to lose. But then through a series of like good alliances with like the other remaining players, like negotiating a peace to be like, hey man, like even though I'm fighting with you and like I could be you, like if I keep fighting you, we're all going to lose, because like this like even stronger player is on the horizon. Um, and then also somehow like that player like did a really bad move. I think maybe they timed out a little bit, but they like still had some of their moves in play. So they didn't get booted, but like they didn't really like to launch all their attacks on me. So then they eventually surrendered. So I was like, maybe that's just a bit of luck. Like I got lucky that that player didn't ultimately like play to the maximum ability. But also through like a series of like leveraging my alliances, creating my own luck, I was able to win that game. And I feel like when you like come from behind a little bit to win, you're like, wow, like that was truly
Yeah.
like a huge victory. And then of course, like some of the games that are memorable to me that I've lost. I mean, I've talked about them, but sometimes you're doing really well, but you're like in the center of the map. So then all the other players that you could beat them one on one, but like if they all team up against you, like you're screwed. So there's like a U.S. Civil War map that I was like from like Kansas all the way to Maryland, like across the center of the U.S. But then there's like one player in Texas, one player in Florida, one player in like Louisiana, and one player up in the Northeast, and they all kind of like ganged up on me, and I was like, oh man, I thought I was doing so well, like I had like so many troops, but an L is an L. You kind of have to take it sometimes. And then other games, like you just start out and you just like do terribly, like everything goes wrong. Like you pick the worst player to fight, they beat you. Some of the people around you go AI. You just never really get a good footing. And then sometimes like you like have a lot of hubris where you're like, okay, like some player like they want an alliance with me, but I think that like they're the opportunity that I can take on. And then like it doesn't work out, and then you feel really bad because you're like, man, if I just allied with that player instead of attacking them, maybe things would have been different. But of course, you have to learn, and in every game, like you never truly know what other players are doing. So those are all like pretty memorable events to me. Where like sometimes I've won like overwhelmingly, sometimes it's hard fought, sometimes I've lost, sometimes I've just like never even like had a chance to begin with. But it's all kind of fun to see like the wide variety of options there are.
Yeah. No, so many memories that come back when you start talking about games that you've won and lost. Obviously, I think the wins are very memorable. Um, some of the experiences stand out to me with, some of the role-playing games that I've played, but honestly, I think that Medieval Britain map really stands out. I think it might have even been one of your games that had gotten me back in with a local deployment that I ended up winning. Which I'll be honest, I don't win a lot of games, so that was very gratifying, and I think the local deployment really brings that added level of how do I strategically move my units around to set myself up for these wins. I think that's a big part of what makes the stories too, right? Because you have to then, if something dramatic happens, you have to be able to adjust and move those troops around, and it feels more realistic, right? Troops actually coming from where they're supposed to almost. So
Yeah, I
I
remember
think
that map. That
that's
was a Medieval Britain Castles game where you could only deploy 10 troops per castle, uh, and you took over the entire bottom half of the map. And then I was like, okay, I think this
yep,
is at the end of the game for everyone. So then we all surrender.
yep, yeah. I mean, honestly, like I said, it's not one that I don't win very often, and that was definitely a fun one to play in. So man, well, it's been really fun just talking with you about a lot of these games. Sort of taking a step back. I mean, you've been playing for some time now. Um, you know, there's so many different avenues that you can go with idle, with multiplayer, single player, and you've done a lot of them, and you've interacted probably with a lot of different players. What are some things you'd like to see, improved in the game itself? Maybe not just from the game's creation, but maybe from the community.
Oh, that's interesting. So I will say, starting out, like I'm not a membership player. I'm not involved in a clan. Like I don't really have like too much interaction with other players. I don't really do ladders anymore. Um, but what I would like ideally is like more creative like multiplayer templates. I think usually you see about like 70 or 80 or so, but like a lot of them are just repeats of like the same type of games, right? And most of them are like 2v2s or like 3v3 team games that aren't like super noteworthy. But some of the ones are like they are like really creative. The ones that stood out to me were like Voodoo's game or like it was Shattered Europe. Like that was like very unique. And then other games, I think one that I thought was really interesting was like it was a game set in Ukraine, like Ukraine the map. But what was very fascinating was like everyone started out really small. There were a ton of like wastelands that had like hundreds of neutral like neutral armies in each territory. But then like every like 10 turns, you would suddenly get like 1,000 troops. And that would be like, oh man, like how are you gonna use these troops? And then you had like sanction cards, but instead of like reducing armies by 50%, they would like give you an increase of like 2 times the amount of armies you have. So I think like if people just think outside the box and create like unique games for each other, it would really, I guess, attract all types of players. I think a lot of times, like if it's just the same thing, it can get a bit stale. I'm sure like when I create like my 60th local deployment game, some of the players that started in the beginning might be like, I want to go to greener pastures, like try something else. So I think like if there's someone to kind of create different types of games in the community, you can see it so that people always have something to try out, to like get to fall in love with. All the players have a dozen or so that keep playing my games. Like I'm really grateful for them. I'm glad like I created something that they like, but I'm sure like other players have created something that other players like. I used to play a lot of um, role playing games. Like you'd see the same players there as well. So I think like yeah, hopefully like more niches can be created for other players as well. That'd be really cool.
Yeah, and I think, to be honest, you're a big component of that, continuing to create your own, um, you know, host your own games. I think you've inspired myself to go and try and do more local deployment games. And I think as more and more people continue to join those small groups, that this will continue on and be a tradition. So thanks for being a part of that. Um,
Yeah.
I think absolutely. Yeah, I think the game as a whole, obviously has kept you coming back to it, and I'm sure you play on your phone and on other devices like the rest of us. But um, what is it specifically, if you had to sum up Warzone to somebody, or share something that keeps you coming back to the game, what would that be?
I think it's just like, I describe the game as like, it's like Risk, of course, like everyone has that baseline. But it's like so much like more complex, and you can like create your own scenarios and like play on like much larger maps. And just to be more succinct, I think what really draws me to Warzone is just you can play games that just have a level of strategy with other people in real time that you don't really get in other games. I think some games are like either too complex, like Civilization, right, or like Stellaris. Like it's like takes a ton of your time. Other games are a bit too simple, like Risk. Even like Diplomacy is like pretty simple. There's only like I think 30 or 40 territories in the map. But I think with
Yep.
like Warzone, it kind of hits that sweet spot for me. Like there's a lot of room for maneuver, and there's not just like one mode of gameplay, right? There's not like a single meta like chess where like someone does something, okay, like then you have to do something back. So yeah, it allows a lot of creativity. I would totally recommend more people to like start playing Warzone if they can.
That's cool. And again, we're not we're not affiliated or promoting Warzone per se, out of the fact that we just really enjoy the game, and I think that's pretty apparent by your statements as well, that it is a good balance of a lot of different things without being too much of the things that keep us out of other games, such as time or complexity. Um, it's got a very good balance of those pieces that we really care about: storytelling, the experience, the strategy. So I think that's a really good way to sum it up. And that kind of concludes what I had prepared for today. I really appreciate you taking the time to meet with me and be on the show. I hope we can continue to do these episodes with more people from the community. But thank you so much for your time and for your contributions to what Warzone is today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jack. I really appreciate it. It's been a pretty long conversation, but it's been a really good one. And excited to hear this episode when it comes out. Excited to hear a lot of other different episodes as you continue and start up again. So yeah, just really excited, and also very grateful that you reached out to me. I told like one of my someone like really close to me, I was like, they were like, why do you play this game so much? Like you're spending so much time. And I was like, well, like I'm getting interviewed by someone, like I got recognized. So that's kind of been a high flow. I've never had that happen to me in any of my other games before. So I can kind of say, it's been worth it to
Yeah,
some extent. Something came out of it.
yeah, for sure. Well, that's all we have for today. Thank you so much for everybody for being a part of the community and for listening. We hope to see you in the next one. If you do want to be a part of the show, feel free to reach out. Otherwise, I will be reaching out to you, and we'll see you in the next one. Thanks, everybody.